All right, if you can join me now, you can begin by letting me know you're here, typing into the comment box that you're with us tonight. And you can begin suggesting your questions to us here as we're preparing to begin the program. Okay, I think we've finally gotten on air with everyone, and I'm lagging a little behind what you're seeing there. But again, we're very thankful for you to be with us tonight. And as I said, we want you to sign in and let me know that you're here. Share this to your timeline and with your groups. And you can begin asking your questions tonight, and I'll get to them just as quickly as I can. Gotten on air with everyone. Now see here what I've done is you're seeing there. But again, we're very thankful. Well, you all can tell that I'm a real technological guru here, and maybe I can proceed without making too big a mess out of this. Funny, Ross. Let's see here. I guess I could get me a piece of paper and do that. But no, as I was saying, share this in your groups and on your timeline. Start writing your questions if you'd like to. And then I have a poll over on the BibleTalk page if you'd like to participate in that. It's a question about instrumental music. I'm going to do something with that in a couple of weeks. And then after we get through, I'll tell you some other things about some study material that I've made available to you on the BibleTalk page. Now, as I had said last week, I wanted to kind of take up where we left off with that passage over in Matthew chapter 18, where the Lord is speaking to the disciples, and I believe it's the only time that we have any reference from Jesus to the local church. Jesus talks about the church in Matthew 16:18. He uses the word there, and he's talking about the universal church. And then here in Matthew 18 and verse 17, after you go to your brother, to him alone, and then you take 2 or 3 witnesses, then he says, tell it to the church. And we know that can't be the universal church, all of the saved, the whole world over, just simply because it's a physical impossibility to tell it to the church in that sense. So it has to be church in another sense. And so that's what we want to explore tonight. We want to talk about the local church. And the reason I'm concerned about the local church, a couple of things. One, I believe in my lifetime, having come in behind, I guess I should say, the controversies that we had in the church over what we sometimes refer to as institutionalism. Some people call these things parachurch organizations, but you know what I'm talking about. Colleges and healthcare facilities and homes for the aged and child placement societies, these kinds of things that somehow became an adjunct to the church. And so there's great controversy just prior to my birth and during my childhood. But as I have grown in age and experience, I have observed that one of the consequences of our concern about activating the universal church and are preserving the integrity of the local church so that we do not drift off into denominationalism has led some people almost, I believe, to just completely disregard the church or to think of the local church as a non-essential or something that's really not important because we put so much emphasis on the individual. And this passage that we're looking at tonight, Matthew chapter 18, is a passage where we make a distinction between the church and the individual. We make it clear there in verse 15. Go and tell your brother alone. That's individual to individual. That's an individual responsibility. And then we observe the fact that that one goes and gets one or two more, and those then go and talk to that brother. And that's still individuals because those three then go and tell it to the church. So the one is not the church, and the two are not the church. And so we see that those three together are not the church, but those witnesses tell it to the church. And we made quite a rather detailed study, I thought, last time about that passage. But I want us to go back to that passage or text just to see there in verse 17 that clearly there's something called church in that passage, and we need to understand what it is. The word church is one of those words, we talked about this last time. It's one of those words that gets transliterated into the English. And it's kind of like that Libby's commercial years ago. You know, Libby's was Billy spelled sideways. It's transliterated sideways. In other words, the word that is there in the Greek would be the word ecclesia. And someone says, well, that doesn't sound like church. Well, no, it's not. But there was another word that was generally associated with that. Well, now I'm tongue-tied. It's the word for of the Lord, kuriakin. And that came into English through the Latin and so forth, and into the Scottish in particular, where the word kirk, K-I-R-K. And K-I-R-K in English became church. And so of the Lord was transliterated. And that was used to designate the people of God, the church, the kirk, those who are of the Lord. And then that was used when the King James was translated in 1611, and then the subsequent translations that have been based on those ecclesiastical words that King James said need to be retained, came into the English as the word church. But the word ecclesia literally means the called out, or actually it refers to an assembly. And it's a political term. We have it here we have the concept in our own Republican form of government and our simplest democratic forms as they exist, particularly up in the northeastern part of our country, New England, where they have the assembly or the assemblyman or the select man. And they have the town comes together and they discuss business with the leaders that they have appointed or elected, the mayor and the council, and their business is conducted in this assembly. And this is how the word is used in Acts chapter 19, beginning there in about verse 32, where Paul is involved in a riot in Ephesus, and some of the citizens try to calm the riot, and they talk about those people and the way they're behaving, how they're out of order, and they refer to that as an unlawful assembly. And what they're talking about is a mob. But then later in verse 39, one of the city fathers instructs them that if there's anything that needs to be dealt with, we can do it in an assembly, that is a lawful assembly. And so the word assembly is used of a gathering together the people for discerning public business. And so it's not just an assembly. It is a recognized body of people. Not anybody and everybody is part of the assembly if they just show up. It's talking about the people who are citizens. It's an assembly of citizens. Similar use of that in Acts chapter 7, where Luke refers to the church in the wilderness or the assembly in the wilderness, or the congregation in the wilderness. And what he's talking about there is the nation of Israel. So those people who were a part of that nation, taken together as a unit, were the assembly, or the congregation, or the church. Now, that word is used to describe the people of God in the New Testament. And as I've already noted, in Matthew 16, Jesus uses it to refer to everyone who belongs to him by virtue of faith in his death. Jesus says, upon this rock, I will build my church. I will build my assembly. It's not a physical assembly, but it is a calling together of his people, and he knows those that are his. And so the word church, or ecclesia, is used to describe those who belong to Christ in their aggregate sense, that is, all of God's people for all time here that have been saved by the blood of Jesus Christ. But we see that word church is also used to refer to something much smaller and organized to some extent. When Paul writes his letter to the church at Corinth, he refers to them as the church of God, which is at Corinth. He'll do that in the first letter, and he'll do that in the second letter. He does that as well in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And John uses the word church in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation to describe the various churches that were located in the 7 cities of Asia that he refers to in those chapters. He will also use the word church over there in, I believe it's 1st John, it's 3rd John chapter 6, 3rd John verse 6, when he refers to the good report that the brethren have before the church. So he says, which have borne witness of your charity, or your love, before the church. So he's talking about a group of people in a certain place, and it's always used to describe the people of God. Well, is it just a Sunday morning assembly, a Sunday night assembly, a Wednesday assembly? Does the church only exist when the people actually physically come together in one place? Or is church, not in the broad sense of all of God's people, but in a narrow sense of those who are in a given area, those who are close in physical proximity to one another, and who have the habit of coming together on the first day of the week to break bread, as Acts 20 and 7 describes the church at Troas, when the disciples came together to break bread. So there were disciples who came together. They were still the disciples. They were recognized as the people of God, but it was their habit to come together. And so the term church describes them because it was their habit to come together. But we see that this church functions, you see. They chose servants, as with Phoebe in Romans 16. They sent out preachers, as they did with Paul and Barnabas and others in Acts chapter 11 and chapter 13. They received instructions from the apostles. Clearly, the 1 Corinthian letter is a perfect example of that, where Paul wrote the church at Corinth, and he was giving them specific instructions. They had overseers, the elders there in Acts chapter 20, who are also called bishops or overseers, and who are called shepherds or presbyters. They tend or feed the flock. And so here's a flock, and it has a shepherd, and that's the church. These churches paid wages. Paul says that he received wages of the churches in Macedonia while he was down in Corinth doing them service. Likewise, in Philippians chapter 4, he received no other church, he says, communicated with me or had fellowship with me concerning giving and receiving except you only. So there were churches who had fellowship, not just an assembly. How does just a group of people who show up at a certain time, how is that anything that can have a relationship with a person? You see, there's got to be some structure, some organization, some purpose and intent behind their existence. The church in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8 was said to take charge of those who were widows indeed. They were going to take her support up. They were going to be responsible for her. Does that just sound like somebody who shows up at a building like people show up at a movie theater and sit in chairs? Hardly so. And then the passage we read just a moment ago there in Matthew 18, the church could have something told to it. I recognize that's an anthropomorphism, but it only has meaning in the sense that there's some intelligence, there's some governance about that body that can be told, can be instructed, and then can give instruction or give orders. And so there are many other things we could say that indicate that the church existed. But these are the principal things. This passage in Matthew 18, 15, and 7 through 17 points this up. How do you tell the church anything if it's just a group of people that show up at an appointed time? It's got to be more than that. There's got to be some oversight. How is it possible that that body, that church, could tell sinners anything? And how can that gathering, as we noticed in 1 Timothy 5:8, how can that gathering, if it's just a gathering, take charge of, be responsible for a widow indeed? These things speak to collective action. These things speak to organization. And so there is an action and there's an organization that refers to the church. And where I'm headed with this is that this organization, is this relationship? I prefer to think of my membership in the local church as a relationship. Is this relationship necessary? And this is the thing that troubles me with the thinking of some brethren, the idea that the relationship that they have to the local church is not necessary. And I'm suggesting to you that not only is it necessary, it's absolutely essential. I do not believe that a person can be faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ who is not faithfully discharging his duty within a local church. Now, in order for the local church to exist, I think we've suggested enough already, but I would call your attention to Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45 in particular. That when we look at this passage, there's something that immediately comes to our attention. That after the gospel was preached and after these people had obeyed the gospel and were baptized into Christ, it says there in verse 43 that fear or reverence came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed, that's those disciples, all that believed were together. What does that mean? There was agreement. And so when we talk about being a member of a local church, there is an agreement that we make. We agree to be a part of the local church, and the local church agrees to be a part of us. When the Apostle Paul left Damascus and came to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 9, it says he essayed to join himself to the disciples. The word join there means be glued to. Paul wanted to be joined with those people. He wanted to enter into an agreement with them, a relationship with them. And so everywhere in the New Testament, we see that disciples entered into a working relationship with other disciples. And it goes on to say that they were of one heart and one soul. And so here we see that this agreement is that we agree to be one with these. That's our purpose. That's our aim. That's what we're striving to do, is to be one with our brethren. So all that believed were together, and they were one heart and one soul. And then he goes on to say that they had all things common. He didn't think of anything that he had as if it were his own. In this agreement, we enter into a relationship with others where we promise and we strive to help one another and to love one another and to serve one another. And so then, in order to accomplish that, it says that these disciples sold their possessions, and they brought the things that they sold, the price thereof, and laid them at the apostles' feet. And so two things come out of that. One, the apostles at this time are the ones in the church who had the oversight. So there was a common oversight to which these folks were submitting. But they were laying aside, they were creating a treasury, they were creating a common fund in which they were all going to participate in, either by giving a share to, or in the case of those who were in need, receiving a share from. And that's what fellowship means, to give a share to and to receive a share from. Paul talks about it, giving and receiving. The Philippians were giving to him and he was receiving. That's fellowship. And so what I'm saying to you tonight, and we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions, but here's a relationship that we see in the New Testament called church. It's not the universal church. It's not that to which we are added, but rather it is our common work with these people who are around us, who are Christians. Now I want to ask you a really important question here, and then this is where I'll start taking and trying to answer your questions tonight. Hopefully some of them on this subject. But here's where it goes. You tell me, what is there that the Lord requires of you as a child of God that you can do with regard to other Christians that does not involve your relationship in the local church? If someone says, well, I don't have to be a member of the church, I can just sit at home. And that's one of the great concerns people have about this current crisis that we're in this country, that we're all cut off from one another and we're not being able to come together in the assembly. And some are concerned, well, it might be that we just don't even have to assemble. We can just all stay at home, watch Jeff on the Facebook, and we can be Christians just kind of virtually. Just tune in and turn on and we're good. And then when he shuts up finally, we'll tune out. Now, that's not what Christianity is. That's not how these people reacted and acted. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 40, in that you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. There's not anything you can do in the service to Christ for him personally. That was the whole question there. Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you naked? When did we ever see you in prison? And Jesus said, you never did. But in that you did it unto one of these, the least of my brethren, you did it unto me. Jesus says, love one another, exhort one another, be kind to one another, serve one another, greet one another. All these things, there's over 50 passages in the New Testament that use that phrase, one another. Where is there any practical application of that if it's not found in the local church? That's the point. And in Hebrews 10 specifically, verse 24 and 25, exhort one another so much the more as you see the day approaching, forsaking not the assembling of yourselves together. But do what? But provoke one another unto love and good works. Where do we do that? We do that in our coming together, but we do it in our relationship to each other as church. And that's a local church. That's not the universal church. Here's some Christian on the other side of the world in Ethiopia. Somebody says, do you love your Ethiopian brother? I surely do. But where do I have any practical expression of that unless I pack up and go to Ethiopia and join myself to an Ethiopian church? I might be able to send some money once in a while, but the reality is that's not what just putting a check in the mail and sending it somewhere. That's not Christianity. Christianity is a relationship. Christianity is what we have with each other because we're cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ, and we are able to enjoy that and experience that in the local church. Well, I've talked enough, and I want you to have an opportunity to get your question answered. I see a lot of people out there. Some of you are my very good friends, and I'm glad you're here. Some of them are members of the local church here. And so just some of them are my kids. That's even better. So just come on and start sending those questions. Ask me questions about the church. I had some people send me some questions earlier about some things, and I had some brothers send me some questions about the Holy Spirit. I'm going to do that in the future, very near future. I had some questions about instrumental music. I'm going to do that in the very near future. I had a question today about local preachers, and that really works well with this subject of the church. And I'm going to kind of switch out my screen here so I can remember what I think about this. But so just start sending those to me if you would right now. But let me deal with this question that came in about does the Bible authorize an evangelist to work with one church, to live in that community and receive wages from this church? Well, certainly, I believe the Bible teaches that the church may support an evangelist, and they may have one that works in the community where they exist. Somewhere along the line, somebody got the idea that to be an evangelist means you travel. To be a minister means you stay in one place. And that somehow it's wrong to be a minister or to be the minister or a minister, but it's all right to be an evangelist. And an evangelist, a minister, a servant, a preacher, they're not any difference in those terms in certain contexts. Jesus intended for the gospel to be preached, and that's going to involve human agency. And 1 Corinthians 9, verses 13 and 14, authorizes the church to pay wages to those who give their entire life to preaching the gospel. Jesus made specific provisions for that. Paul says the Lord said. So 1 Corinthians 9, actually the context begins in verse 4 and goes down nearly to the end of the chapter, but verse 14. And so the Lord made provisions. But when we generally talking about this question, we're talking about whether or not he can live in one place and preach at the same place every Sunday and the church pay him wages. That doesn't make a fella a pastor, and it doesn't make him a hireling because he works with one church. There are so many Bible examples of where a preacher worked with one church. Paul stayed at Corinth for more than 18 months, Acts 18:11. He stayed 2 years with the church at Ephesus, Acts 19, verses 8 through 10. Paul commanded Timothy to abide still in Ephesus, 1 Timothy 1:3. And he left Titus in Crete, Titus 1, verse 5. Paul authorized the elders, especially those who gave themselves to preaching and teaching, to be counted worthy of double honor. So the church can pay wages to either an evangelist, a preacher, or an elder if he's working, giving himself completely to the work of preaching. There's absolutely nothing in the scriptures that prohibit this. Now, the question was framed in such a way as to say, well, what about having fellowship with those brethren who choose not to have a preacher? Just as there's nothing that says let's put it this way, there's positive authority for having a preacher work with a single church and to pay that preacher wages. But there's absolutely nothing in the scriptures, to my knowledge, that says that's an absolute necessity. Because clearly the instruction about the elders makes it clear that some of those elders might do their work and like Paul on occasion, make tents, provide for themselves. Then others might give themselves to that fully. And so the brethren could have qualified men among their elders who could handle all the teaching that needed to be done. So there's nothing that necessitates that a church have what we sometimes refer to as a local preacher. But when brethren say you can't have a local preacher, they've crossed a line. And I don't know how to get people to understand this. I've been trying to do it for years and years because I've debated the located preacher question and the women teacher question and the question about Bible classes and so on and so forth. So many different things that get into the realm of liberty. And what's wrong here is the principle that's violated is what Paul said in Galatians 2 and verse 5. that with regard to the Judaizers, he said, when they said that Titus had to be circumcised, says, I resisted them. I did not give them place for 1 hour. So they were not allowed to bind their opinion. So, brethren, when a church makes a decision on some of these areas where they have liberty, whether it's the Bible class or it's the preacher or whatever it is, they have a right then to make that decision, and we ought to let them make that decision and observe it. But when they start saying that you have to do what we do, that's when we start having problems. And the brother asks, can we have fellowship with them? Well, my experience has been that they take care of the fellowship question themselves. When I do what I know is authorized in the Bible, or I refuse to do what I know is not authorized in the Bible, those who are either going to go beyond or those who are going to make laws are going to take care of this fellowship thing on their own. And I'm not going to have to solve that problem for them. And so that's pretty well where I leave that. Now, I had a question here come up in the stream, and let me get back over here. I'm going to have to back up a little bit so I can see it. Someone asked me about verse 20 in the context of Matthew 18, and I did say something about that last week, but I don't mind saying something about it again this week because I keep seeing brethren quote this passage, and they're missing the whole point. The passage that says, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. It's not talking about brethren meeting down on the creek bank or meeting in their home or sitting in the front seat of their car somewhere, whatever it might be, and 2 or 3 of them getting together and taking the Lord's Supper and that Jesus is there. That's not what that passage is talking about. This passage is talking about the discipline action that was discussed in verses 15 through 19. And so, as touching anything, the thing that's being touched or agreed upon is the disciplinary action. Whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the whole thing is established. And what the passage is saying is when that process has been properly executed according to Scripture, and the witnesses have given their testimony, Jesus is saying, I'm there with them. Just like when Paul said to the church at Corinth concerning the fornicators, he says, it's as if I was there and judged them already. He was in agreement with them on the sinfulness of that behavior because 2 of the witnesses had come over there and told him. Same principle. Here, Jesus is saying, recognize that I am with you in that, see? And so that's what that passage is talking about. It's talking about the 2 or 3 in agreement according to the discipline. Doesn't have anything at all. Even in a secondary application, I can see no way to turn that into something that justifies our participating in things that are restricted to the assembly outside of the assembly because 2 or 3 of us are there. That's not what that passage is saying. See, this gets back to this idea of the non-importance of the local church. There are some things, and I believe the Lord's Supper is one of those things. There are some things that Jesus has restricted to an assembly of the saints. In that case, it's the first day of the week assembly when the disciples come together to break bread. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, they did this in one place, when you come together in one place. Now, you can tell I'm not too technologically savvy because it took me a few minutes to get on the air here again tonight. I'm learning how. But as much as I'm enjoying this and as glad as I am to be hearing from some of you, I assure you that this is not us together in one place. And as much as we might like for it to be, it's not. And so I don't see how in the world that this can be substituted for an assembly. Now, I had a brother ask me this question. He says, didn't know if this would fit in. Well, I'll make it fit in. But he says, the present distress, do you think the local church is wrong for trying to have a worship service via Zoom as many are doing today? Well, that phrase worship service. Let's get something straight. Worship is what we do. And worship involves the veneration, the reverencing of God. And aside from the concept of being fearful or reverencing God, there are some things in which the Christian is authorized to participate wherein he expresses worship. And some of these things require us coming together, and then some of them don't. I can pray alone. Jesus taught me to pray alone. He says in Matthew 6, go into your closet and pray. But we can pray when the disciples are all together in one place. Acts chapter 4 makes that clear. There might even be a group less than the whole church praying. Acts chapter 12 is an example of that. So one Christian can pray together. Some Christians less than the church can pray together, or the church can come together and pray. All right? Same thing is true of singing. Is any merry? That's one person. Let him sing psalm. But we see in Ephesians 5 that the only way you can explain that passage, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, that requires an assembly in order to do that. That's congregational singing by definition. So there's some things we have to do together. There's some things that we can do apart, and they have different aspects of the same thing. Now, when it comes to the Lord's Supper, I know of no arrangement found in the New Testament for the taking of the Lord's Supper other than in an assembly of the saints on the first day of the week. Acts 20 and verse 7, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 20. That's all I know about. It is my conviction that if I am excused from the assembly on Sunday morning wherein the supper is served, I am excused from the supper. When a person is homesick with the flu, we don't send out the deacons to take his temperature and swab him to make sure he's got the flu. We accept his testimony on that because we want to believe all things and hope all things about our brethren. I think there are brethren who lay out, so don't misunderstand me. I know people do that. They literally forsake the assembly. But here's the reality. When a person is sick, he's at home, and we accept his testimony on that, and we don't carry the Lord's Supper over there to him. So why would we expect him to take the Lord's Supper if he's at home sick, or if he's at home preventing illness, or he's at home taking care of someone who is ill? I had back surgery back in 2001. I didn't attend an assembly for over a month because I was laid up in the bed. I was not supposed to do anything but walk a little bit every day in my recovery until my back healed. I was not to drive across town in a car, and so I didn't assemble for a month. The brethren didn't send me the Lord's Supper, and nobody suggested that I had sinned by not eating the Lord's Supper on those particular Sundays. Why is it that all of a sudden now we think we've got to eat the Lord's Supper? Is it because we don't have the knowledge that there are other people down there eating it together? Is that what's bothering us and disturbing us? I want you to think about this. So we understand that concept. And when we use Zoom or Facebook or whatever some of them are using, and I've watched some of these services, and I'll just be honest with you, I am very troubled by what we're doing. I'm not going to make a fuss about it. I'm just going to try and teach people the truth, and then hopefully after we all get back together, we're going to realize how important the assembly is, that we're going to solve some of these problems. But the reality is I'm not going to tell people they have to eat the Lord's Supper at home. I just don't think it's necessary. I don't think that's what the scriptures teach. Now, if you ask me, well, do you think they sin by doing it? I don't know that I know the answer to that question. I don't know that it's the Lord's Supper, but I don't necessarily know that it's a sin. Now, if you do, you can send me some instruction here, and I will happily consider it. Some have been talking about, well, we're forbidding people from coming together. Well, not in the state of Texas. They're not forbidding anybody from coming together. And if people, as far as I know, our elders are not forbidding anybody from going down and assembling in the building. We're just trying to make arrangements that lets everybody do this kind of thing according to what's in the best interest of people's health. And my Bible still says, love one another, love your neighbor, and love your enemies, even as you love yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So I'm going to try and protect and preserve other people's health when I can't even know for sure myself that I haven't contracted this illness. Now, I think I'm without it because I've been in the house for nearly a month, about to go crazy. But that's another subject. Some of you might say, well, you were already crazy, Jeff. It's just kind of manifesting itself a little stronger here lately. That may be true. But the reality is that I just don't see how Acts 20 and 1 Corinthians 11 requires anybody to do that outside of the assembly. And when the circumstances are such as they are, we recognize that we're just in a quandary and we're caught in a big mess, and we're going to have to work our way through it and get back together. Now, my good brother Aaron asked me a question about Hebrews 13 and verse 17. It says, obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls as they that must give an account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. And he says, it seems to me that Hebrews 13:17 would require membership in the local church in order to be ruled over by shepherds. Am I correct in this thinking? Well, yes, that couldn't occur except in a local church situation. Now, some of our brethren have taken the position on elders that elders don't rule, and they try to make some thing out of this word, rule and obey. But the shepherd rules. If you look at the passages that talk about the actual shepherd or even Jesus as a shepherd, he rules. And the concept of the shepherd king is one of a ruler. So the ruler, the shepherd, the king, in the context of Jesus, or here the under shepherds, they have the rule. They have the authority over the flock. They lead them out. They lead them in. They tend to them, they bring them to water, all of these things that we know in the shepherd imagery. Well, you're not going to get that if you haven't got shepherds to follow. Now, one of the sad realities is that some churches don't have shepherds, and I'm afraid that some churches don't want shepherds. That's a whole other subject unto itself. But if I want to be in the kind of relationship Jesus wants me to be in, where I have older brothers and sisters who can encourage me, as is described in 1 John, where we have the older and the younger, or as Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, submit yourselves unto those that are older. If we want to have that kind of relationship, and then at the same time have a relationship with those who are our peers or younger, and we are to love them as brothers and sisters, and the older men and the older women as fathers and mothers, if we want that kind of relationship that the Bible is talking about, we've got to be in a local church, because that's where the shepherds are. That's where the elders are. That's where those who have the rule are, and they're there by common consent, and they're there because they're qualified according to the teaching of the scriptures. Now, let's see here. I had let's see here. Looks like my good friend Bill up in Indianapolis, he's got a comment here. Says, seems many religious people do not understand the primary purpose to assemble is to worship. And that I don't like to say anything's more important than another. And I'm not trying to argue with Bill or nitpick him or correct him. But sometimes people say the Lord's Supper is more important than singing or preaching. No, none of those things are more important. They're all important. They're all things that the Lord has enjoined upon us. And if we recognize that the Lord has put the Lord's Supper in the assembly, and he's put giving in the assembly, then we need to be in an assembly in order to participate in those things, you see. Now, granted, we might be able to do some singing outside of an assembly, but we'll never fulfill Ephesians 5 outside of an assembly. I just don't see how. Teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, that necessitates a congregational setting. And while we might pray one for another outside of an assembly, certainly that when we come together and we have ability to know one another's needs in the context of that assembly at that time, how could there be a better way to pray for one another than in an assembly? So I would agree with Bill that yes, there are many important functions associated with the assembly that a lot of people just don't get. They think they're a member of the local church like they're a member of the country club, and that's just not so. It's not that kind of thing at all. Then I have a brother here asking me to tell us your thoughts on whether or not an elder might be paid a wage if needed by the church. Well, certainly, if one of the things that a lot of churches do is they overlook the most qualified man in the congregation to serve as an elder. If he meets the qualifications in all areas, and he's certainly able to teach, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with making the preacher an elder. And that would certainly harmonize with the instruction of 1 Timothy 5. But there are a great many elders who, men I've known, who were willing to quit their secular work. Maybe they got to a place in life that they could afford to do it, or they just chose to do it. And the church put them on the payroll, so to speak, as a full-time elder, and he was teaching and preaching. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's certainly what needs to be done. And there have been some men who are so good in that work as an elder that they just want him to be free to be able to do the things that he can do that exhorts and admonishes the saints. And so, I cannot imagine the church in Jerusalem after Pentecost and the first few years of its existence with so many thousands of Christians that there were not a lot of fellas that they just had to say, look, you need to give yourself to this all the time and take care of this responsibility. So certainly 1 Timothy 5 would permit that. Now let me say this, it may not necessarily be the best judgment. In other words, here's a man. If I were in a position, and I'm trying to do that with respect to my preaching anymore, I'm trying to support myself. If I can support myself and do preaching, or support myself and do teaching, or should the church ever call upon me to be an elder or deacon and I could do that, I would do that. So it's a wonderful thing if we can not charge the church. But if the church needs a man and they can get him freed up to do that work, so they pay him a living wage, then by all means do it. I think that would probably be the best thing in some instances, rather than some of the things that we're doing with preachers anymore. Because I'm not sure that everybody that calls himself a preacher necessarily is one. And if you have to, you can quote me on that. Let's see. Rita says here, there were several congregations years ago that split over the idea that you could not have a located preacher and elders in the same congregation. And that's exactly right. That's the old Ketcherside position, where Brother Ketcherside came up with the idea that preachers preach and elders teach. Well, there's not any, find in the New Testament where there's a distinction made between teaching and preaching, or who does it. It doesn't exist. That's an arbitrary man-made distinction that does not consider the context of the whole. And Brother Rydell Hoover there, he's talking about context. He's exactly right. You got to look at the context on all of these passages, whether we're talking about Matthew 18, or we're talking about passages that talk about gospel and doctrine, or we're talking about passages that talk about teaching and preaching. There's no difference in those things. You preach gospel, you teach gospel. You preach doctrine, you teach doctrine. And the 1 Timothy 5, the passage we've been reading and referring to talks about the elder who labors in the word. All right. Well, that's talking about the gospel. He's preaching or teaching the gospel. Then here's a question from a brother up, Mark and Saul. Does the phrase to break bread in Acts 27 indicate the necessity for the loaf from which the Lord's Supper bread can be broken? Well, that's a tough question. We have some brethren who make just the same ones who talk about drinking from the same container as talking about breaking the bread off the same loaf. So they have one container and one loaf, and their position on that is that if one eats, they all eat. So I'm definitely not going to go in that direction where they make the unit of communion, that is the unit that participates in the eating, to be the whole church. And so if the whole church doesn't eat, then no one has eaten. And we've got brethren take different attacks on that to try and justify or oppose different things. But by the same token, every example we have of Jesus in the words of institution, or as Paul, he took bread and broke it and gave it. And so there seems to be some significance to that. And that's another reason why I don't really like some of the things that brethren are coming up with. I just have a hard time, even though I'm prepared to accept the idea of an individual drinking vessel, because clearly the cup is the contents and not the drinking vessel. So intellectually, let's put it this way, from the standpoint of a reasonable argument, I don't see any distinction to be made whether we have one piece that we break and put in 4 different trays, or we have 4 different pieces that are in 4 different trays that necessarily were not broken off the same piece. I don't think that's the point of that, because there was more than one loaf in the tabernacle as far as the 12 tribes were concerned. And I have no way of knowing how many different loaves of bread there may have been when the Lord instituted the supper. But there does seem to be some significance associated with that. And so I think the arrangement we generally have, where we pass a loaf and folks break off of the loaf, is the best practice. But I'm not going to start dividing the church over that kind of thing. I just don't know how that has any merit. But now someone may have something to say here that gives me some insight that I haven't had before. Now, I know that some are going to this, the Holman people, the Baptist publishing house. They've come up with a self-contained Lord's Supper, kind of a unipack thing, like when you go and buy a Lunchable. You get a container, and it has a seal on it for the juice, and then there's a bubble on it for a wafer of unleavened bread. And again, I'm not objecting to that. I just don't know that that's the best thing to do. But I'm going to leave that to the local churches. Then, all right, so that was talking about one cup again. Well, it looks like I've kind of gotten through the list. I'm going to scroll back up here and say, Dwayne asked me a question here that I skipped over. What is the elder being worthy of double honor about? Well, it seems to me in the context, because he quotes from Deuteronomy there in 1 Timothy 5. He's, first of all, worthy of the honor which he is due because he is an elder. And he had spoken of that earlier in the chapter. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. So there's the first honor. Older men, and certainly the elders in the church, are worthy of the respect of their seniority. Let's put it that way. And then when you come down there to verse 18, those elders that rule well and are let them be counted worthy of double honor. And then he goes on to define that in verse 18. So the double honor would be on top of their being esteemed, as Paul puts it in 1 Thessalonians 5, being esteemed by the church, is that they would be treated even as the ox is treated. You muzzle not the ox that treads out the corn, because the laborer is worthy of his hire. So the point being that the servant who works is worthy of being paid a wage, just as we were saying earlier with preachers being paid a wage. So here we have the elder who is working in this way being paid a wage. And so I believe that's what the double honor is. But again, in order to be worthy of that, he has to be the kind of man that he ought to be regarded as an elder. And then he then has to be doing the work that needs to be done in laboring or giving himself fully to the word. Well, I got just a few more minutes here, time for maybe one or two questions, depending on how involved they are, that you could get in here. I'm going back, scrolling up my list to see if maybe I missed something. Again, let me mention to you that over there on the Bible Talk page on the left-hand side, there is a tab for a poll. And we're talking about instrumental music, and I got a feeling that it's going to skew one way or the other, but I'd just like to see how that's going to work out. It's just a simple yes or no question. I'm going to try and have some of those along to ask folks to kind of get some sense of things to talk about and that sort of thing, and how to talk about them. So go ahead and participate on that. Go over and join the Bible Talk with Jeff Asher Facebook group. And these videos are there. Some announcements and things pertaining to the program are there. And you can put your questions in there. And that's where I got a lot of questions that I'm kind of holding back that I didn't answer tonight, particularly those on the Holy Spirit. They came in kind of late, guys. And believe it or not, I still have to study a little bit. And so I wanted to look those over before I waited off. I want to do a little study and answer your questions as best I can and try to get them properly dealt with. And then tonight, also on my Facebook page for Bible Talk, if you'll go over to the photos section, there is an album there, the title of which is Should Local Churches Exist? And in that album are a bunch of charts that I made several years ago when I preached a lesson by that title. And it is, I think, some good information, helpful information that you can study. It deals particularly with this idea that the local church is a relationship in which Christians function to fulfill their duties and responsibilities to the Lord Jesus Christ, and in particular to one another. When I think about what Jesus said there in Matthew 25, in that you have done it unto the least of these, your brethren, you have done it unto me. That just puts so much significance, if you will, to our relationship in the local church, because that's where we are serving Christ. And we serve one another through love. It's not just love of one another. It's the love of Christ whereby we serve. If I love Jesus, where am I going to be? I'm going to be where my brethren are. If I love Jesus, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be doing what my brethren need me to do. If I love Jesus, I'm going to be teaching the lost, because that's what Jesus would do. If I love Jesus, I'm going to be encouraging the weak, because that's what Jesus would do. If I love Jesus, I'm going to be assembling with people who are studying the Bible and worshiping and praising God. Why? Because that's what Jesus would do. Well, I'm out of time. I appreciate you so much. I hope you'll join us next Thursday. And again, keep those questions coming in as I try to get off the ground running here And I'll promise to do a little bit better on getting on the air than I have done. It's just going to take me a little practice. But thank you so much. I've enjoyed being with you. I've enjoyed answering your questions. And we wish you a very good night tonight.